So now the moment that we have been waiting for is here, and this is the time for the closing plenary. And this plenary is going to look at a forward-looking agenda for gender in agriculture and food systems research. And I can see that our speakers, our panelists are here. So my role is just to introduce our moderator for this particular panel, and she's going to introduce the various panelists and also the session. So ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to bring to you Jemimah Aurora Johnson, who is Professor and Chair of Rural Development at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. Professor Jemimah works with questions of sustainability and justice in relation to environmental governance, climate politics, and rural development, Her work is shaped by the need to examine rural development in its particular situation, but in the context of wider transnational currents and relations. I can see Professor Jemimah right on my screen, and she's all ready to take this panel forward. So welcome, Professor Jemimah. All eyes on you.
Thank you, Vivian. I'm extremely pleased to be here for this conversation with such an interesting group of people who've spent so many years working on questions of gender development, agriculture, and resource management. I haven't met you all, but your reputation and your work precedes you, and in a good way. I'm also very pleased that we have people here who have worked with these issues in both the global North and South. Firstly, because as work across these contexts has shown, issues of gender and its intersecting dimensions of power can play out in strikingly similar ways across different geographies. How they are similar or different can help us understand the specific context better as well in order to work towards justice. And secondly, and importantly, given the world that we live in today, the food supply chains, the work of international agricultural organizations, or networks of solidarity across boundaries and between the North and South, makes it imperative to understand how gender and power plays out in these connections, how inequalities might be reproduced or countered in these relations. As studies have shown, power dynamics within policymaking, for example, of international organizations are often colored by global North concerns, but also there are unexpected positive outcomes that may come out of many of these relationships. Unexpected, I suppose. Agenda 2030's focus on sustainability for both the North and the South makes these connections all the more important that we look into and research. I hope we can discuss some of these issues in the next hour and also how you have addressed them in your many different ways. In our panel today, we have activists working for social change, heads of platforms and organizations, donors. Some have led regional dialogues on gender and agriculture. Several have worked in multilateral organizations, in universities and research organizations. So welcome today to all our panelists, who are, I'll start with Rolando Cerda. He is a researcher and professor at the Tropical Agricultural Research and Higher Education. We have Nicoline de Haan, who's director of the CGIAR Gender Platform. Maybe you could just wave. I guess people can see your names though. We were meant to have Philip Otieno, who's the executive director for Advocates for Social Change. He is not here now, but he might pop in, I guess, come in at some point. We have Jemimah and Njuki, Africa Director at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and UNFSS Custodian for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. We have Vicki, Wilde, Senior Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and Bettina Bock, Professor at Groningen and Wageningen Universities. So welcome very much. I would like to start with asking you first about something about yourselves. I would like you to tell me what you think has been your major contribution to this field of gender and agriculture and food systems. And then from your perspective or your context, what do you consider to be the most crucial question in relation to gender in agriculture and food systems? And is it getting the attention it deserves? And maybe we could start with Jemimah. Could we start with you?
Thank you very much, Seema, and so glad to be in the panel and in this conference. Overall, I have learned so much from the sessions I have attended. My contribution to this field, it makes me feel very old because I started working on gender equality and agriculture back in the late 90s. As a PhD student, working on issues of gender and farming systems, and looking at how women's engagement in certain practices is affected by the systems of land tenure and the role of social capital in guaranteeing women's access and rights to land. So I've worked both as a researcher. I worked for many years in the CGIAR as well, looking at gender and markets, looking at women's time use and how that affects both their nutrition outcomes and the nutrition outcomes of their children. But I've also worked as an implementer, taking some of the research results and seeing how could we apply these at scale. So I started the CARE USA's program on women in agriculture, working across continents to see how we could build on women's collective action on groups such as village savings and loans associations, self-help groups, to actually build their economic empowerment, but to also link them to service providers so that we were working at both the demand and supply side. So applying some gender transformative approaches for women's empowerment. But I think I would say part of my bigger contribution has been as a funder, and really influencing how organizations like IDLC, where I spent about 7 years, could be much more systematic and intentional about providing resources for gender research, but also getting their programs, including the biophysical programs, to actually take gender much more seriously. So whether they're producing vaccines, to not think of cows as their end client, but to think of people as their end client. And if they thought of people as their clients, as the users of the research, then the way they developed these innovations, the way they delivered them, the way they designed them, automatically change it. Not really automatically, but they start thinking about who are the users and what are the different needs of the users. And are the needs of men and women users different? Are the needs of poorer women livestock producers different, for example, and making sure that they're designing for them. And now I'm working at policy level, seeing whether we can actually influence governments, policymakers to actually prioritize their investments with gender equality in mind, that the outcomes of systems shouldn't just be healthier diets or nutritious foods. Those are important, or well-being. Those are extremely important, but that gender equality and women's empowerment also becomes a key part of what our food systems are supposed to deliver. And then I've been encouraging people to publish on gender and food security. So I founded a journal with a couple of my colleagues to promote scholarship on the topic. It's still up and running. Those who are listening, check it out. Journal of Gender, Agriculture and Food Security, a great outlet for a lot of the work, but really also promote authorship and publications from low and middle income countries. So I guess in short, that's where I'm coming at this field from. In terms of the key questions that remain, I think the last couple of months I've talked about this a lot. That within food systems, we focused a lot on the roles that women play, on their individual capabilities, on their collective organizing, and we haven't taken as much time to think about how systems actually need to change to support women who are working in food systems, and whether those are institutional systems of how gender responsive, how gender equitable systems organizations are. So we just launched a report called the Global 50-50 that looks at women's leadership, gender equitable policies and outcomes from a set of systems organizations, both regional and global, and whether those are financial institutions that have to think much more critically about how they design financial products so that they work for women. So it's important to make sure we're building capacity and expanding women's agency, but equally important if we want to go to scale to actually change our own organizations and the rest of the institutions that work in food systems so that their policies, their practices, their strategies, their work is actually responsive and empowering to women. So that, I think, is a fundamental question for me that isn't receiving as much attention, as much investment as it should be, because I believe that's actually how we get to scale with equitable outcomes for women.
Thank you, Jemimah. This was really interesting. So if I'm of course paraphrasing you a little bit, so you would think, you said policy, the importance of policy cannot be overstated, right? It is, and the fact that it is your big contribution has been in donor organizations where it is possible to change policy that has an effect on the ground. And also importantly, how it is important to change the organizations that we inhabit and not only on the ground. I think that's really important. I think Phil Otieno has just joined us. Phil, are you there? Can we see you?
I am here. Let me just put on my video.
Okay. Good. So maybe I just go straight to you. Would you like to tell us what you think has been your major contribution to the field of gender and agriculture? And what question do you think is the most important today for us to deal with?
Okay, I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, for me, what has been important really is with regards to how particularly researchers should adopt participatory right-based approaches in terms of looking at how to engage with communities when they are conducting researches in terms of agricultural research, not to guard against it being extractive, but rather being participatory in its form. And this really essentially means to even when the research has been conducted, it's important to go back to the people where you did the research to be able to actually give them the results of the same and how that is going to transform their lives, basically. Because a lot of times what has really contributed to the negativity when it comes to research, the kind of researches that have been done, is the extractive nature of the research. So for me, that has been extremely interesting. Another thing is with regards to how we address the new approaches, especially in terms of engaging with men and masculinities in the different spaces. And I'm talking about this because that's my area of interest, where we must engage with men and boys in these issues going forward. If we want to address the women's agencies, women's voices and choices, then it's also important that we also bring to light an analysis of how the men's power and privilege contributes to the inequalities that we experience in the different communities. I will give you an example. For instance, like in Kenya, only 1% of women own land title deeds, and only 5% of women own the same with their partners or spouses. And that's very telling of how then research can go forward in identifying some of the the gaps that exist when it comes to ownership and engaging in businesses and agricultural and in the markets, and including agricultural engagements in terms of female and male involvement in the same. But lastly, I would quickly say one of the other things that I also want to talk about is how do we frame the kind of engagement that you have with in terms of engaging with men and boys, but also women in those spaces. what kind of language, the framing of the language, if we want to engage with men, are we talking at men or are we talking with men to be able to bring about changes? And if we can consider language in terms of the framing or even reframing of the same, that will be very, very key in going forward. And one of the things I've found very going forward, the kind of talk that has been generated at the conference with the questions for climate change adaptation and mitigation, I think that is very key. And if only that can be taken to the very lowest of the rural setups of the different countries, that can be very good. And of course, supporting women in terms of building their capacities to be able to address their own agencies, and also what Madam Vicki just talked about. Really strengthening women's agencies requires institutional change. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me?
It's breaking up, but yes.
Yes, I'm saying, yeah, sorry, I was just saying, in terms of changing institutional practices and policies, and I don't want to mansplain what she just said, but I would just want to add my voice to the fact that even when you're engaging with men, especially to bring about transformation, it's always important, yes, for one man to change, but changing one person is not enough if you don't change the institutions and the structures that shapes their behaviors and their practices within their context. So that is important. Even as you go about doing, thinking about the research, those are areas and entry points and things that you need to consider. Over. Thank you.
Philip, can I quickly ask you, so do you think this engagement with men and speaking with men is getting the attention it deserves in the world of development, and especially when it comes to agriculture?
I think right now it's very theoretical in its form and text, because people talk about we need to engage with men more, we need to do much more analysis and in the understanding of masculinities and stuff, but I think it's not given attention that it requires in terms of resourcing. And I think the discussion has always been we don't want to divert resources that is meant for women empowerment to engage in efforts to also address masculinities, which I agree with. That's very important. We also need to get to know at what point in time do we go in terms of engaging with men and boys without really actually reinforcing the iniquities that we've seen over the years. But I think, going back to your question, I think it's not being given the attention that it deserves. And also the other thing is that even when it comes to like doing the evaluation, the monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, I think it doesn't happen to scale, because most of the programs that engages men are short-term. And therefore, even, so the scalability is questionable because of the short-termness of the engagement. So we need to do so much more. And as for somebody who has worked in this space for over the years, I still feel we are just, it's lip service as opposed to really practical.
Okay, thanks, Philip. That was really interesting. I'd like to move on to Rolando. Rolando, would you like to tell us what you think your major contribution into this field has been, and also what you think the most crucial question is today that we need to address?
Okay, thank you, Sima. Good morning from Costa Rica to everyone. Well, I'm an agronomist and agroforester, no? And my passion is to do research in agriculture and try to translate the research results to training for people in the rural areas and also for development actions, of course. No, so in the last 10 years, I have been working in regional projects in Latin America and the Caribbean, not trying to improve the well-being of rural families through interventions in important cash crops like coffee and cacao, but also in food crops in home gardens, which is very, very important. No? And I think in this context, my major contributions to gender in production systems were the increase of the participation and empowerment of women and youth in training events, no? Given that we always try to, in our institution, to apply inclusive methodologies for learning processes, no? both in formal courses, no, in international courses, master programs, but also in farmer field schools, which is really important in the field. No? And I think also we contributed a lot in the empowerment of women, especially in these home garden land uses in Central America, especially, no? Which resulted in the improvement of food consumption of the family, and they produce this food with their own means. No? So I think these are my major contributions. And regarding the questions on the crucial research questions in relation to gender in agriculture, we have a reflection here in our team. And then one crucial question is, what is the impact of the agricultural knowledge and skills of women on the improvement of cultural practices, crop yields, and food security of rural families? No? Because we think if we demonstrate positive impacts of these aspects, no, and how they occur with scientific evidence, then we can elaborate better strategies and policies, no, with a good support for the development of programs to improve more benefits and empowerment of women. No? And related to that question is also to respond what approaches, methodologies, means, or interventions are the most appropriate to increase this empowerment of women in agricultural research. No? So we needed to identify several options to attract, I think, more women scientists, no? Women students, women technicians, and women farmers to be involved in research. No? And also to apply this in underrepresented countries and at different levels, not only in the field, but at institutional and government levels. No? And finally, well, I think these questions at the moment are not getting the necessary attention, no? Unfortunately. For instance, the knowledge of farmers in general are not differentiated by gender. No? Usually men respond to the technical or scientific surveys. No? So we lost information from women there. And we also think that there is no incentive for women to get involved in research, at least in the Latin American and Caribbean region in general. No? Thank you.
Thank you, Rolando. That was really interesting. Bettina, would you like to tell us what you think has been your one major contribution to the field of gender in agriculture, and what you think is the major question for us today?
Yes, thank you, Jemimah. As you know, I'm working mainly in what you might call countries of the North, in Europe, or in relatively high-income countries. And in doing so, I have focused on the role of women in what you now would call agricultural transitions, who turn to multifunctional and sustainable agriculture, as well as their participation in policy making, policy formulation. Their representation in policies and politics, as well as the responsiveness of policies to their situation. And in the latter, I'm looked into farm women, but also non-agricultural rural women, because certainly in Europe, farm women are the minority in rural areas, quantitatively speaking. At the moment, I'm working a lot also at the regional level, so revitalization of marginal rural areas, where I would widen the scope from gender also to age, race, and spatial inequality. And I'm very interested in how all the aspects play together in creating advantage and disadvantage. So in many cases, it's also the margin, being already located in marginal rural areas adds to the disadvantage, but might also create opportunities for innovation, agricultural innovation, social innovation. And I think that is also interesting to add to what already has been said in terms of subjects that would be interesting to follow up. I think it is important to go beyond the farm level and to see to what extent gender issues or matters of social inequality and injustice and the need for agricultural transition are taken up in mainstream organization, are represented in mainstream organization, how they can be influenced, but also how which new and unusual coalitions there are coming into existence to promote that transition. There was also yesterday, I think yesterday or the day before, was a representative of female entrepreneurs who was pointing at the need for affiliation. And I think there is a need of affiliation between women and men who are trying to do things differently. But I think there is also a need for coalitions, intersectoral coalitions. So I think there are a lot of young people, young women and young men who want to change the world, address climate change in new ways, produce food in new ways, develop rural areas in new ways. And I think these kind of pioneers of innovation are interesting to follow. We should focus on them, and we should seek to find out in what kind of unusual coalitions they make that happen. Because although it's important to change the existing institutions, we already do that, try that for many, many years, and they are slow to change. And I think there's much to learn from these young pioneers.
Thank you, Bettina. That was really interesting. You did tell us a lot about, I mean, I've been reading your work for a long time as well, and I think you've done a lot of interesting work for this field. So I can think of lots of things you've done, but would you not tell us what you think has been one of your major contributions in how we think about this issue, or, you know, or in the field of gender and agriculture?
I think what I try to point out is that what I always try to show is how women make change, realize change. So, for instance, the importance of women in innovating agriculture, turning towards more sustainable agriculture, because they bring in new knowledge. They are newcomers, and yes, they are often valued less, and they have to fight against a lot of barriers, but they bring in so many valuable resources and so many valuable new ideas. And in the process of innovation, they show their capacity, their capability, and their importance. And the same goes for civic initiatives or social innovation in marginal rural areas. There are a lot of obstruction, a lot of problems, but also a lot of potential for renewal that is important also beyond those marginal areas. Or so maybe point out the power that marginal actors have because they are not so burdened by tradition.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. Can we go over to Nicoline? Nicoline, would you like to take a shot at these questions?
I'll take a shot at it, building on quite a lot of what other people have said. I mean, I think Jemimah and my career in that sense have been quite similar in following and trying to figure out how we can need to get CG systems or agricultural systems to actually start accepting women more as partners. I think it started off, my father is a livestock specialist. And so as a child, I would be all taught, you know, what are the breeds of cows? But I was always wondering, why aren't we asking the people what they actually want? And that sort of got me on a career of figuring out, we have all these women who are in agriculture. How can we give them the best technologies? How can we ask them what they need? And how can we move that forward? And so having done that through several different organizations in several different situations, and also moving some of the gender discussion a little bit away from, you know, intra-household discussion, who gets what rights, etc., but to more a higher level. I tried to, along with Vicki, actually pioneer looking at how can we actually include women in livestock master plans. Women are so important in livestock, but somehow, you know, these livestock master plans are investment opportunities for countries, and women were absent. But it's not that simple, because most of these investment plans are built on a herd model. So where do you put people in that? So trying to push those agendas a little bit more forward has been quite important to me. And how can we leverage the amazing work being done by all sorts of technical scientists to put them in the hands of the women who are also doing a lot of the work? So I think that's what I've always been very passionate about, and I feel that we do need to do. On the question of where we need to go, one of the things that's come up, I've really enjoyed the whole conference, and I probably need a week or two to really think through everything that happened. So I have sort of three levels that I think are important in what we're looking at. One, I think, is the big, large one. We all talk about food transformation becoming more equitable, but what does that actually look like? And how do we need to get there to actually, how many steps do we need to actually take to make sure it's equitable for everybody? Because we still don't understand exactly what that means. So I think that's the bigger question I would have. Then there's a sort of a middle level, which I've really learned this week, is we still need multiple voices. I mean, it's amazing the richness of people, what people have brought to the table this week. And I think we can only learn from that. I mean, sorry to use Vicki again. She always says, don't try to do everything. I don't think we, or at least the gender platform, should be trying to do everything, but the community needs to. The community needs to continue growing and continue having those multiple voices, multiple ways of looking at things. I mean, several of the sessions really opened my eyes to new ways of looking at things. And I think by building upon that, we'll move forward. So I think that's neat. Talk to governments, but also, there's a call to talk to activists, get activists involved in the conversation. How can we do that? And that's sort of what Rolando also was saying. I think those are important things. But at the same time, and I go back to this, at the same time, we still need to do the simple, well, not simple, the smaller things. How do we make sure a technology gets to a woman? How do we make sure that woman actually can use that technology and can actually use it well in her life the way she wants? Not us telling her she needs to be empowered, but what does empowerment mean for her? So all those different things I think are going to be important as we move forward. So yeah.
Thank you. And since this is so appropriately, we've been talking about Vicki, we go over to Vicki now. Vicki, would you like to take over?
Well, hello, everybody. I'm coming to you from Seattle this morning. And first of all, my hearty congratulations on what I think has been an amazing event. When you ask me what my contribution's been, first of all, I'm not a researcher. I've never been one. I have been a practitioner, perhaps a facilitator. I started working on gender issues in 1989, Jemimah, that's way before you. Just showing my age, 1989 at FAO, I started working on gender issues in community forestry. And frankly, for the next 11 years, I spent time living in communities, villages, in several Asian and African communities on food security, extension, forestry, a wide range of issues. And it made me come out radically convinced that all of our goals could be better achieved if we brought a gender lens to it, including I did some years in war zones. That recovery and rehabilitation would happen faster too if we had a gender lens from the beginning. And from there in 1999, July 1999, I joined the CGIAR. And I was the director of gender and diversity, working with all 15 centers. And 7 years later, I became the founder of AWARD, African Women in Agriculture Research and Development. So what I learned in all of this, it was a very careful dance because, to be honest, this white savior, white Northern woman savior thing is a very real thing, and it's not useful. I hope that it's been all about putting forward voices. I put a huge emphasis on strengthening leadership of women in Africa and Asia, strengthening science, mentoring, and leaderships. It's about their voices first. And in fact, just to be honest, while I'm talking personal journey, I rarely show up to panels anymore because I'm so uncomfortable speaking about Africa and Asia where we work. I think there are so many great, strong voices from the communities to do that. But sometimes I have to show up to speak on behalf of the Gates Foundation. Now, I've been at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for 7.5 years. I am the program officer, the senior program officer responsible for investments in women's empowerment in the agriculture sector. And the CGIAR is one of our highest priorities. And within that, and as part of the changes going forward, we're really focused on how the CGIAR is the global center for helping our poor planet have the resilience and adaptation to the climate shocks. And what's coming is just shock after shock after shock. And all our goals for inclusion and equality and intra-household harmony and all of that is going to be wiped out over and over and over again if we don't strengthen the rural communities' resilience and adaptation, if we don't ensure the absolute best practices, technologies, and social institutions are made available to rural communities. And this is not happening today. A study by IFPRI and the Green Climate Fund showed that less than 2% of climate finance is reaching rural communities. Well, that has to change, doesn't it? And then the role of the CGIAR and the role of this gender platform, this community, if more of that funding, as we try to get more of that funding focused on the rural communities where climate adaptation must happen, what would you do with it? What are the rigorous, proven, tested approaches, methodologies, findings? What would you advise? So I see that as the most important thing going forward for the CGIAR and for this gender platform. You're an R&D organization. This is an R&D platform. So to do the R&D and then to work in allyship with the women's organizations, the other organizations to help support the whole ecosystem for better equality. I like what my friend Jemimah has said. She used this expression when it came to financial services. It's not about making women more bankable. It's about making financial services more womanable. I really like that expression, Jemimah. And I think it's about making all of our agricultural systems, the extension system, the livestock systems, the crop testing systems, all of it, the breeding. It's all about being more womanable and inclusive, because I think every time resources go into agriculture systems that do not have this equity lens and that do not support women's empowerment and all the voices, we're perpetuating a status quo. And it just makes it even harder to change. So we've got to bring that lens into every opportunity. It's no small risk, but this role is R&D.
Thank you, Vicki. Yes, I suppose it is research and development, and but the question is then, where do we look, right? Because and several of you said that what we need here is institutional change, and Jemimah offered one way of doing it. I mean, she said being a donor. She sees her role as a donor is really important in doing that, because she's working, I suppose, I don't know if you would call yourself that, but as a femocrat from inside out, which is really important, which is a lot of the research doesn't look to those organizations because it's very difficult to actually look at those organizations that they open up. And, I mean, it's easier to go back and look at communities, but which is also important. And I think one important thing that came up among all of you was making visible the power of marginal groups and also with marginal voices and women's knowledge. And Rolando, you said that you would think that we need, you're working with scientists and others and coming from a natural science background, and you think that we need more scientific evidence and methodologies. But I would say maybe if you turn it around to what Jemimah said, we need to think about how science actually works. Is it time that science needs to address how they might need to change, and what are different kinds of scientific ways do we move forward with? And which is in a way what I'm coming to my next question when I talk about, what are the ways forward for transformative research? Practice too, but since a lot of people here are researchers, but also research, how do we change the structures, the institutional structures that we have in very concrete ways? And Philip talked about participatory approaches, for example, which are really important to reach out and to work together with people and to be accountable, I think, which both of you said. So I think there's lots here, and multiple voices are important, which include, I suppose, donors, but also a whole range of other people and coalitions that are working with these things. So there was actually a question from the audience, and this is to Bettina. But I think a lot of you touch upon these. And if we start with that first, and we talk about, the person asks, it's CATIE Pitesh, and she asks, this idea of marginalized actors who can move forward is very powerful. Could you please elaborate on it? So Bettina, would you like to start, and then maybe we can open up the question to the others as well. I would like you to think of this question in terms of what can we do, all of us sitting here as researchers or donors or practitioners, what can we do to make these voices audible or rather have a center stage in the work we do? So Bettina?
Yes, I will try to elaborate on it. What we tend to do is to point at the disadvantage of women and the injustice they experience by not being taken seriously, by not being treated equally. And all of that is important. But I think what I have learned in time is that injustice and calling upon solidarity is not sufficient to make a change. What we need to point out, and this of course has also been taking place and has dangers of its own, is to point out how much we need these novel ideas and novel practices that are born from the marginal, in a way born from the marginal position, or that are born from the fact that you come new into a field. And in Europe, a lot of women come new into agriculture. That's different from other countries, of course. And what I'm not pleading for instrumentalizing women, because that's the risk, of course, of what we call the efficiency approach. But it comes close to what Vicki and Jemimah were also saying. We can fight for ages to demand, either to adapt women to the system, to empower them so that they can play the rules of the game as they are, or we can point out how important it is to change the rules of the game and what you can learn when you turn this system around. And one of the things that for me have become very obvious in the struggle around climate change is this, that we talk to politicians for I don't know how many years that things need to be changed, or that agriculture needs to become more sustainable, and they move by millimeter. So it takes ages for them to turn just a little bit. Whereas at the same time, there are groups who make it happen, maybe at small scale, maybe not changing everything in one go, but practicing new ways and new ideas. And I think by focusing focusing more on how to support that and stressing less the marginality could make a difference. And I think this awareness of a difference can be made. And there, if you allow me, I make a step to the next question. I think in terms of education, we play a very important role. And what I see with our students is that a lot of our students want to make so much difference in the world, but have the idea that they only learn how difficult that is. So especially in my field of international development, I hear students say, yeah, but you always tell me to be critical and you point out to me why things don't work, why policymakers should not be trusted, why donors only are interested in making money, etc., etc. I'm making it a little bit black and white. And in doing so, I lose courage and hope. And I think it's very important to whereas what we want them to become those responsible scientists that make a difference and that take account of justice and that assure the sustainability of our world. But what we need to do them is teach them how to do that, encourage them that this is possible. And maybe you will not be able, you will never be able to do that on your own, but also small steps and small things matter. And I think it's important to encourage it. It's important. There's also a lot to be learned and then to be transferred in terms of knowledge.
Thanks, that's really important. And the small steps and education. And it's true, as critical scholars, there's a lot about how everything goes wrong, but very little about what we could, in a way that we would move forward. And I think that's a really important aspect to think about in this. But if I go on to maybe Jemimah, could you tell us how you've been moving things along in millimeters and hopefully making inches and meters and feet?
I usually worry that the conversations my generation is having, those of us here, might be the same conversation that the next generation has. And that worries me, because the feminists that came before us, this is the conversation we're having. The issues might look slightly different, but it's the same conversation. And that worries me a lot. And I really worry about these moving inches and millimeters. We need to do that. I totally agree. And earlier this morning, we were talking about the power of women themselves, women's agency, the fact that they do have agency, the fact that they are organizing even at the grassroots to effect change. And we need to keep supporting that organizing and those movements. At the same time, I keep thinking we are also in spaces, and especially those of us that are sitting in this conference, because I believe if we have women farmers, they are the minority in this particular conference. We are sitting in spaces where fundamental systemic change needs to happen, so that we can support the grassroots movement, so that we can support women to exercise that agency. And so I keep saying, we've got to look at this from a four-lens window, that we are supporting and supporting women and other groups to expand their agency, to realize their aspirations, to change the system in the small ways and the big ways that they can. On the other hand, we need to make sure, if we are controlling, if we are the ones that are leading the science, the R&D that Vicki was talking about, if we are the ones that are leading those financial institutions, we've got to make sure that we are ensuring that women, groups, poor women, marginal women are actually accessing those resources. And that has to do with the way we design them. That has to do with the way we understand what their needs and priorities are. So that's the second window we have to look at. And then the third window, some of us here are policymakers. They are leading institutions where we know even the internal policies of those institutions, the way they conceptualize the work they do and their outcomes isn't ideal, isn't working for a lot of people. So those institutional political barriers, we've got to work at them. And then what Phil was saying, the norms have to change. And that will take engagement. The talking with, he was talking about with men and boys, and the role of education in defining a whole new kind of masculinity that believes in the empowerment of women, that believes in the dignity of all people. Now, if we look at this and approach this from the four lens window, depending on the spaces where we sit, I think this is the only way we're going to make progress. One of the things that struck me the other day is we've been talking about unpaid care work for years, and especially for rural women, because a lot of the interventions, especially around childcare, are happening in urban areas. It is companies making sure there's childcare in their premises. It is municipalities making sure childcare, early education is available for working mothers. In the rural setup, we're still seeing women do extremely hard work you and I wouldn't even want to be doing today, with babies on their backs. They're spending days in markets standing with babies on their backs. Now, if you even just think about that aspect, that is women exercising their agency, yeah, to go to the market, to sell their produce. What can the system do for them? We had a governor there that they start a whole rural market somewhere in a county in Kenya that has the most fantastic daycare facility I've ever seen in a rural market. This is the power of having that systemic change happening, because we can have one woman exercising her agency or a group of women exercising her agency. The moment we have in Kenya 47 county governments that decide all our infrastructure from today is gonna include elements of supporting women for their unpaid care work. Just think about that kind of change. And those of us that are in a position to actually influence that kind of change, that's where we move from getting women moving in millimeters to actually getting them jumping. Oops, I think.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I was really enjoying that discussion, and unfortunately, it looks like our moderator is having connection problems, but probably maybe we can just continue. I believe that perhaps Jemimah, you can just stand in for her a bit as we try to get her back.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
So let me see if I can do this. The question that she was leading us is what these future big questions are. How do we move forward to actually effect transformative change? And probably I'll just go to Vicki to talk about, from a donor perspective, what does this actually look like?
Thanks, Jemimah. So, the way I approach it today is really influenced by my 13 years in the CGIAR. I remember just years and years of watching the handful of gender researchers having tiny budgets, and each of them being on like 15 different research projects, and they just weren't enabled or set up to succeed. And then they weren't a terribly diverse group either. And if we're looking for progress, I mean, one thing to do is look at the gender researchers here at this conference. I mean, you can see real progress, more gender researchers, more diversity and inclusion, and a lot more rigorous, validating, important work on a whole bunch of key questions happening. So This is good. As a donor, I look for within each opportunity, I try to enable the elbow room to do really good, expansive, inclusive gender research. And I do this by, first of all, ensuring that there are gender experts in the team. Oftentimes there's a whole lot of text about we're going to do this, that, and the other, but there are no gender researchers supported in the budget, or if there is, it's a 1/10 of a person, that kind of thing. So that doesn't get through. We make sure we're supporting gender researchers fully and senior researchers. We make sure they have adequate budget, and we make sure they have an adequate timeline. This idea of getting results within a year, 2 years, 3 years is ridiculous. These issues take a long, long time. So just from where I sit, I try to enable this work. Now, they in turn have to do all the other, other tasks, but that's what I can do from where I sit.
Thank you, Vicki. And that sounds so familiar, this 10th and 20th of a gender person that somehow is supposed to move the needle on this work. So very practical things there on what donors can actually do to support this. As we wait for our Seema to come back, I want to ask a question to Nicoline that's on the chat so that we can combine this conversation. We sort of can bring the audience into the room as we go along. Someone says, yesterday in the plenary, we heard about the option of involvement of rural women farm practitioners as grassroots researchers. Do you have ideas how we can build sustainable long-term cooperation with the ground and build out trust beyond short-term projects? What are your thoughts, Nicoline? And of course, taking into account that communities also have their lives, would there be an additional burden that we're placing on them? Nicoline.
A very good question, and I think Rolando might also be in a good place to answer this as well. I mean, I think it's very important that we do indeed start with the whole grassroots, and I think a lot of the research that we do, and a lot of the researchers in the CG do start there. I mean, it's building up that community trust, it's building up that conversation, and that's often a little bit the difficulty when you have a gender researcher coming in a project that's 2 or 3 years, and all of a sudden they're supposed to go into a community, understand the community, and come out with results in 2 or 3 years, where we all know to really get good results and to really get an understanding on gender norms, etc., you need the trust. So I think it is an important thing. And I also appreciate what I think it was Seema who said that, and I was thinking about that today, is how can we actually build up one of these really participatory from the beginning research with a group of women and take it throughout the whole process, because I think it is important as we move forward. But again, also understanding that, you know, we do have our own constraints. Vicki is trying to work from within. Jemimah, you try to work from within. So how do we balance that in such a way that we can actually move forward? And for me, one of the areas that we're trying to do, at least within the platform as well, is actually fill some of those evidence gaps. And partly I say that because I've noticed time and again, people pick up the same story and do the same research. And so we need to put all that research out there so that we actually move the discussion forward too, so that we don't keep on talking about, you know, women are overburdened. Yes, they are overburdened, but what do we do about it? How do we move it forward? We don't always do a little descriptive work here, a little descriptive work there, but we actually understand how we need to move beyond that. And I find that just as important in moving that dial, instead of, and again, it goes back a little bit to what you were saying, Jemimah, so that we don't end up 10 years from now in the same conversation because somehow it all disappeared. How do we continue building that momentum and make sure that that information is out there and publicly available, so that we actually do get the next generation of gender researchers who can do the in-depth, much more in-depth. I mean, we have done a lot of this, you know, what is the importance of women and livestock vaccines? We need to take the next step. How do we actually make sure that the vet services, who are often very masculine, actually understand the importance of having women involved? And again, to point out from Vicki, Vicki's doing a wonderful job in India with women animal health care workers. So can we do more of that? So for me, that's important too. How do we fill those evidence gaps to make it to the next level, to actually get more nuanced depth in all the work we're doing? We still talk about women as if it's one group. There are a lot of different type of women, and can we start targeting that better? Can we start understanding that better? And that goes back a little bit to your first question about grassroots. Yes, we need to continue going back and listening and being humble about what we want and what we need. And that goes again back to it. You know, I've always been irritated by people say, we're going to empower. Who are you to empower? People empower themselves, and we need to listen. How can we, you know, listen in the sense of what they want and what they need? So a little bit of an answer, maybe not completely, but a little bit of an answer.
Thanks, Nicoline. And that ties in so well to what Phil was saying earlier about it's not just understanding that grassroots connection and building that trust, but making sure that the results of the research actually can benefit the communities that we work with. Rolando, you want to add anything to what Nicoline has said?
Yes, thank you. I can contribute to part of this question on how to involve more women in research. You know, I think it's very important to promote the use of technology nowadays, you know, by women and youth. Several years before, we already had technology, but maybe these women and youth didn't have access to this. But I think, for instance, in the context of Latin America, they already have access to internet, to cell phones and other devices that they can use. No? So we can take advantage of this now and teach them on how to use the several and many digital applications that we now have for research and for development purposes. No? For instance, in coffee, there are several applications here to teach how to manage the crops, how to contribute with information that then other people are going to use. No? So if we promote this for both women and men, so women can use this and can feel more empowered and more attracted to do research and collaborate in this kind of projects. No? And I also think that this very essential to encourage the formation of more women scientists, no? Especially women of rural areas and women of indigenous groups, for instance. No? Because we strongly believe that local or native women knows perfectly the needs of their own communities. No? They are the people who can say what we need to research, what we need to respond, and then what we need to translate into development and well-being for their families. No, so I think it's essential for governments, donors, and universities to put more scholarships to this kind of groups. No? Thank you.
And to make sure that investments are going there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Our moderator is back.
I'm back. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened. I just got kicked out in the midst of everything.
I'm glad you're back.
Thanks. I was going to ask you, there are a whole bunch of questions as well, but I wanted to ask you actually, if you haven't already discussed it, but Jemimah, I was struck by it that you said that we are having the same conversation. And I've often felt that doing research that we are talking, I mean, a slightly different context and different ways, but we're talking, having the same conversation. And yet, as people working with gender, and all of you have worked for quite a few years in the field, I was wondering how do you say, what do you see as having changed, you know, over the years, and both good and bad? Where do you see the process going? Anyone who would like to take this on?
I'll take a stab at it. I do see changes. I see the power of women's organizations. women's producer group, and SEWA was here in one of the panels, for example, and the incredible impact that SEWA has had, and there are many other organizations, and the evidence is really clear. Working with and through women's organizations is highly effective. So that this is very promising. I see changes in government. More and more of them have gender strategies for their agriculture development plans for the years ahead. What they need from the CGIAR is more proven approaches to incorporate in those policy directions. There's greater political will, I would say. And then an emerging area that I think is absolutely essential, and it goes to some of the questions in the chat. You know, how do we, on the one hand, address global challenges, and on the other hand, engage grassroots women, you know, their voices? And this is extremely challenging. Well, there are more and more intermediaries who will take the back office part, take the financial flows, the HR, the management, the reporting to the donor, whatever, and just enable the resources to those grassroots areas. You know, donors are not good at reaching small, and lots of small. We're not, but there are there's a new area of gender lens investors. And I think this is very promising, and could be over the coming years, could be very promising and help us bridge these gaps. So gender lens investing is another one. And then meanwhile, just look at this week. I see a huge change from the early years of the platform. I see a lot of diversity and inclusion. Over 1,000 people registered for this. I remember at the original gender meetings in the CGIAR, we could fit around a dining table, and we did. This is huge. This is wonderful. This is good change. It needs to be nourished, and it needs to produce solid results, and help be agents of change going forward. And that takes rigor. That takes great testing of methodologies, and it takes strategy. You know, what are the key evidence gaps that this group's going to focus on, and while others work on other areas. But I see progress.
So there is hope. You talked about the power of women's organizations, and I was at a workshop the other day with a whole lot of women's organizations who felt that funding had actually dropped for women's organizations. And some of you here are sitting as donors. Is that something that you do, support women's organizations and all from the grassroots up to through the intermediaries and to the international level?
I'll say from the Gates Foundation, traditionally we did not, because we don't do small, but now we do. This is a sea change happening, as gender equality is one of our top priorities of our foundation. And I'm sure it's hard to avoid hearing Melinda and Bill speaking to this quite frequently. Gender equality is one of our top priorities, because inequality undermines all of our goals, whether health or agriculture. And so there is more funding. There's a $1 billion gender fund that's just gone out that's supporting women's grassroots organizations. And I think there will be more investments in these kind of intermediaries as we go, so that we can do a better job. But historically, no, this wasn't something we were set up to do, because we just work at a much larger scale.
Thanks. I have a question here from one of the participants, and who writes, as we know that men and women have to be engaged in transformative change, and we need to connect across scale, as several of you have already mentioned, and the change in the so-called South and change in North. My question, what can the North learn from approaches developed elsewhere, for example, CGIAR gender platform and the other way around, and how to strengthen global change together? That's a small question. Nicoline, do you want to take it? Since I mean, they mentioned the gender platform as well. So the question is, what have you learned from what does the North learn from the South? And I guess a lot of, the people involved in the platform are from the North as well. But also how to strengthen global change together.
I mean, I'm just taking a quick stab, but I see Bettina has an answer as well. For me, one of the big quick stabs is partially having conferences like this. I mean, and that's one of the reasons we do try to have a conference, for instance, with a partner to allow different thinking and different approaches to come out. And so that's one of the reasons we were doing it with Wageningen, for instance, this year. And 2 years ago, we did it with Canberra University. So I think that is one of the ways we do. And even for me, I mean, I'm myself Dutch, but have grown up across the world throughout my life. But even some of the comments about the Dutch agriculture were, an eye opener for me about, the fact that a woman is in most statistics on farms, it's usually the eldest or the one who works the most hours. So by default, that's usually the male. So understanding things like that across the world, I think we can learn from each other. So, but that's just a quick stab at that question.
Thanks, Bettina.
Yeah, in the chat I was answering to a different question, I think. What can we learn is the persistence of attention and the persistence of research into the question, whereas in the North, the interest in gender equality has shifted a lot during the years. It was relatively high at the start of the 90s and went down in terms of funds available, in terms of students interested in the topic, in terms of the urgency felt, and it's getting more attention again. And in that sense, it does relate to what I was saying in the chat. I think in a way, you could maybe argue that the slowness, the fact that change proceeds slow, and that at the same time there is such a big demand for wider change, helps us to or makes others realize that there is an urgency to change, but it's not only on behalf of women. And I think that makes a difference. What I remember from the university, the attention is among students is getting bigger. So more students are interested in justice, in equality, and in gender, but also in race and in spatial inequality. So for them, it hangs all together. The moment you focus only on one of the dimensions, it becomes more complicated. Among senior, let's say the establishment, it's still a point of discussion. But if you bring it together with the need for transition, then you can get a lot of allies. And I think that is important, and that is also it's also important to get allies in the field. So it's important to get allies in the research, but it's also important to get allies in the field. And because women don't live on their own.
I was also thinking, actually, when it comes to the North and South, I mean, one of the things I've realized working both across the global North and South is that things that are okay to talk about in the global South, which is gender equality and justice, or, marginal oppression of women or discrimination of women, are definitely not things you can talk about in the global North, because here, we're all supposed to be so equal. So as a result, what actual discrimination often gets hidden and not talked about. So for example, in environmental policy, you can have a lot of development, or partly, of course, because development organizations are not responsible directly for policy, as domestic environmental officials might be, but it's easy to talk about gender in environmental policy or agricultural policy in the global south for development organizations, but they would not do that in their own countries. So I would think an important thing would be to think about in your own countries to bring those lessons back, because actually it is also, there are also problems, and gender is an important, gender and other intersecting dimensions are really important in agriculture, even in the global north. So, and I think a lot of, like Bettina, you said, a lot of the research is focused on the south. We haven't had all that much, or to the same amount in same extent in Europe, for example. So I think for me, it has been really useful to think about how we have worked in the global south, the research that has been carried out, and actually bring it back to the north as well.
I think it works both ways, but there is a difference in awareness also among women themselves. Mm-hmm. So that is the same, and I see the awareness growing again, but there is also a lot of resistance to vocalize that in terms of oppression. And I think that has to do with vocabulary, but that has also to do with manifestations. So there are, we can learn a lot from each other, but there are also, and not only, but it's very important to take account of the context and of the, not only the structural, but also the themes you can link up with, and the problems that are experienced or that are prioritized, in order to make it also, to not make it top down and to make it work. It's not us saving the world.
Yeah, but I guess
you understand what I mean? I don't know if I used the right words, but it's you have to, yeah.
I was thinking of also what you said earlier about coalitions and collective action, because that is also much more accepted in the global south in a sense. There women have been, I mean, a lot of the gains have been made through collective action and women's organizations, whereas I find, at least in Sweden where I am, it's much more individualized. So gender equality is seen as individual equality much more, which makes it also more difficult to organize and to demand change.
Today, it wasn't always the fact like that. So we have very strong women's organizations, and that's what I mean. It's like it's in time, the awareness or the urgency felt, and the way you formulate it. And I think I see young women forming feminist groups and wanting to work on that among themselves again. Yeah. But a lot also want to do it together. And then it's part of a struggle for climate change, or it's part of struggle for food security, and of that it can be part, but it's there is repetition in terms of maybe we need these women's organizations again, but at the same time change has also happened, and we have to find new ways to organize it. And I think in the end, it's what Phil was also stressing. In the end, it's something we need to do together, as men and women, as inhabitants of this world, of fellow human beings.
Yeah, thanks. I guess Greta and her the Fridays for Future and so on are examples of exactly what you're saying. I have a question here from Kokila Pereira, who says, CGIAR researchers are collecting information from the rural women, reach them, but the benefits to them are overlooked or really low. It is unethical. So I would suggest to include change achieved as an outcome, incorporating work for development organizations. I wonder whether you have already done such work, if you can develop real ground-changing methods, measurements as part of your wonderful research, especially in gender and gender transformative research. I guess the question is, how can you work on the grassroots with women?
I can take a stab at that one. It's a really important issue, and it's one for an R&D organization to ask itself, because on the one hand, we're investing a lot in in sharpening, validating the metrics to help us track whether agriculture programming is empowering or disempowering and so forth. And that's extremely important. But a lot of our grantees, for example, CARE, who is here and presenting, they've got this balance where they do, for example, the WEA metrics on the one hand, but on the other hand, they have what's called a participatory progress tracker. And this is the community's own goals. And in a very visible way, they track their own progress. And therefore, the data and the information become a source of empowerment in itself. And I think this is very important. And I agree with this comment. More attention and more opportunities for that, because at the end of the day, none of us here can empower anybody. It's you know, how are we expanding agency? And some of that is through information, and where people have an opportunity to analyze their own information and to track their own changes is really important. And there are a number of participants in this conference who are doing that. I'm glad to say. We need that balance. I like, it's not either or, it's both.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess this kind of fits in with another question, which I suppose maybe Philip, it says, yesterday in the plenary, we heard about the option of involvement of rural women or farm practitioners as grassroots researchers. Do you have any ideas how we can build sustainable long-term cooperation from the ground and build trust beyond short-term projects? And since you were talking about participatory research and accountability, I thought maybe you could say something about this.
Thank you, Seema. I think basically what you need to start with is first and foremost, when you talk about being about transformation, is the understanding that everything that we are talking about here, especially with regards to issues of inequalities, particularly the way women have been subjugated for years and years and years. The first thing is really to understand that we are at a deformation point. That deformation requires information. Information will bring transformation. Transformation will take us back to reformation. And having said that, I think for us to be able to engage in terms of shifting the power, we need to start from recognition, recognizing some of the issues that women have undergone over the years, the historical injustices, and the next R will be to redress, seek redress for the historical injustices. And when we have redress, it comes along with redistribution, and redistribution here of resources. And the redistribution of resources can not only happen if we don't have women on the table and them just being part of the menu, but they must be on the table so that what you're talking about is also the representation of women. So I'm talking about the 5 R's: recognition, redress.
The question was more, I think, more like on the applied is, how do you do it? So how do you involve rural women as grassroots researchers, for instance, in highlighting the 5 R's, for example?
Yes, for instance, I think the involvement, that's why I'm talking about the 5 R's in terms of representation, because it is very important for us to recognize those who have the lived experience can actually be the ones to speak about those experiences. The only thing that they need is a space and a platform for them to be able to shine a spotlight on some of the issues that they grapple with. For instance, if women cannot be able to own land and they can access land, and I will give you an example. In Kenya, we have a situation in the tea plantations where women are the ones who are going to the tea plantations, they pluck the tea, they take to the factory, but when it comes to the day of the pay, it is the men who own the pay card. How does that affect women? So women do all the work, men get the money, and then they use that money. The day they get the money, they are never even seen in their households. They disappear. They come back when the money is depleted. And I think so engagement of the people who have those experiences, especially the women, is very key, is at the heart of what we need to do as researchers, need to engage with those women to be able to identify some of the challenges, the issues that they're grappling with in terms of their own advancement in the different contexts. Because then again, like Bettina said, women are not homogeneous. Yeah, so you have to be able to identify every when you go to a context, identify some of the challenges that the women are going through and be able to address those issues, including the division of labor at the family, at the community level. Those are things that you need to pay attention to, because if you don't listen to their voices, then that becomes very difficult for you to do. And on the other hand, sometimes, a lot of times actually, researchers go to the ground and they tell people, we want to do a research on 1, 2, 3, without necessarily actually asking those people what they would want you to research on. Because when you do a research, in the long run, it helps in programming and policy formulation, including legal frameworks that come alongside that. And remember, those actually come from the social setup that we have in any conversation. So for me, it has a lot to do with what we normally call the 4 I's. What happens to a woman as an individual, what happens to them at the interpersonal level, what happens to them at the institutional level, all the way to ideological level. But all in all, changing the structures that shape their practices within a given context to be able to empower the women at the grassroots level. Over. Yeah.
Thanks, Jemimah. I see that you have you want to say something. I just want to ask Phil very quickly. There is a kind of addendum to this question. So this is in connection with what you said. Could you tell us briefly? You talked about engaging men in a rather about how engaging men is rather theoretical. Do you have recommendations for researchers to make that more concrete? And very briefly, so that we can go
Yes, very quickly. I think what we need to do is to look at how we can be able to challenge the powerful and institutionalized notions of masculinities within these institutions, particularly by looking first and foremost in the male privileges. And we need to do research on the male privileges and how that affects women in the long run. For me, that is a very key thing, because by and large, the privileges that men have, everything is about male privileges, male order, male centeredness, male supremacy. And no research has ever been done on how that even affects the communities and particularly women at the grassroots level. Thank you.
Thanks. Jemimah.
The conversation before actually triggered two memories for me from when I joined the CGIAR in the early 2000s. This idea that we need to engage more at the grassroots level, but that engagement should not just be as an extractive process, but as a process, as something that we walk through together. As Nicoline said, you really can't empower people, but you can facilitate that process and ensure that women actually and communities actually do have the information, the resources, the technologies that they need and that work for them. So when I joined the CGIAR, it was at the height of the participatory plant breeding era, where the idea was go to communities, work with communities to figure out how do they want their maize, how do they want their beans, which traits are important for them, how is it color, is it the nutritional value, is it cooking time for beans, for and then working backwards in the research to actually figure out how do you deliver that, and actually going through this process from the beginning to the end with farmers, to the point where researchers are actually delivering these products that communities actually have been part and parcel of defining. And it was a huge time of developing tools and processes to do this in a way that was empowering, in a way that did not necessarily add labor burdens to communities and so on. And I do hope that we are seeing with these gender transformative approaches a process of going back to that in terms of how we do research. That's the one memory that got triggered. The second one is I joined CIAT, and actually we got closed down at some point because we were told this is not really scientific enough. But we went to communities in Malawi, in Tanzania, in Kenya, in DR Congo. We were like in 9 countries, and we had decided to sort of have this process that we called community-led development, and that communities would define what their vision was, where they wanted to go. And we, as social scientists, we were leading this process because we strongly believed that research will only become relevant if it is actually enriching and supporting communities' vision of what they want their lives to be. But we did this like for 6 years and generated the most interesting research results around how even biophysical scientists can come in to support community aspirations for what they want to see in their lives. We were called the Enabling Rural Innovation. I was with Susan Carrier in the earlier session, and we spent years implementing this. And of course, in the CGIAR back then, that was not scientific enough, so we got closed down at some point.
Which kind of brings me to what Rolando was actually talking about. And Rolando, you were talking about, you know, kind of convincing, making this work more acceptable to science in a way, and having better more scientific evidence in a sense. So given that, there was a question which I thought you might be able to answer, and I'm afraid I think we're going to wrap up soon after we are running out of time. This is from Jennifer Twyman, and she asks, this is a very interesting conversation. I agree that women can be powerful actors of change. I think we have to be careful that we don't put the burden of change on them. Do the panelists have any ideas on how to ensure this balance is achieved in the work we do? So Rolando, given what you were saying about the need for better approaches and methodologies, how do you think that can be done so that we make sure that the onus isn't put on the women?
Yes, it depends on the way how you are going to organize and design the research. I totally agree that we don't need to put all the burden on women. So for instance, in our projects, when we develop research with people in the field, we always try to identify lead women and lead men. No? So we try to have the same number of persons participating in the design of the project. No? So that way you can ensure that you are going to have the ideas of men and ideas of women. You are going to train with the same opportunities and with the same resources to these groups. And then when they go to the field, so they work as a team, not separately. So they work together, and of course we do several instances of following of the project. They collect data together as well. And it's very important that they also participate when we do the dissemination of results in the communities. So it's important also that women gave these results and how communities can use these research results in their production systems, in this case, that we work.
Thank you. I have lots of more questions that I would like to hear from you, but I'm afraid we need to wrap up soon. I was thinking, Rolando, you said that we would give them the same opportunities and the same space. I would think maybe giving marginal groups more space, since they have a different starting point, would be also a good idea. But again, as I said, I'm afraid we need to wrap up. And I think Marlene and Marguerite wanted to come in right now, right?
Yes, indeed, Professor Sima. Yes, Marlene and Marguerite are coming up next.
Okay, I just want to thank everybody so much for this really fascinating conversation. I would like to, and I'm really sorry well, it's my bad luck that I disappeared for, I don't know, 10 minutes in between. But I really enjoyed listening to and talking to all of you. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Professor Sima, for the excellent moderation. And thank you to all the panelists, Jemimah Njuki, Rolando, Cerda, Vicki, Wilde, Phil, Otieno, Bettina, Bock, and of course, Nicoline, Haan. Thank you very much. That was an excellent session. We really enjoyed it.